So how writing for mass media is different from any other type of writing? Well, first of all, obviously it's the subject matter. There's a variety of subjects and formats, from feature story to editorials to hard news, and we'll talk about them this semester. We'll talk about all those genres, how they differ, and what they are. The second difference is purpose. For a mass media writer, usually you have three purposes: to inform, for a news writer, to entertain, for, let's say, a feature writer or someone who is working on television scripts, and to persuade if you're doing writing for advertising and PR. Another difference is your audience. Your audience is mass audience because you are trying to send information to multiple people at the same time. And of course, this leads to a different style of writing. And then the fourth is writing environment. That's the presence of others, deadlines, editors that will make a lot of changes to your work. So writing environment for news writers especially is pretty stressful. You're always on a deadline. Sometimes you have to write in the newsroom in an open space. Pretty much any newsroom I've ever worked for, we had a large open space when multiple people are making phone calls, someone is running, preparing for their broadcast, someone is preparing to submit their story. So there's always a lot going on around you. And as a news writer, you really have to learn how to concentrate and be able to just complete your work on time because still you're on a deadline. And then you have to work with your editor to make sure you implement all the changes and make it the best story possible. So let's move on to the next slide. So what professionalism means for a journalist or a news writer? Well, first of all, versatility. And we'll talk about this later this semester when we'll try to create stories. The idea of this universal reporter. It's not necessarily good for the quality of news pieces, but that's the reality of modern newsrooms. When you write now, you have to be able to multitask at the same time. Sometimes, as a news writer, you also have to take care of social media management or some part of it. Sometimes you have to take pictures for your stories. You also have to go work in the field, interview your sources. You have to do background research. You have to put your story together. And on top of that, you have to work with multiple stories at the same time. So your ability to be this universal reporter, knowing a little bit about every area, is really helpful because you can create the best product possible. The second element is ethics. And we'll talk about ethics. Also, we'll talk a little bit about law and how it regulates overall what news writers do. But if we start with ethics, the basic idea here is that sometimes you have to report on stories that might involve ethical questions or unethical questions. Sometimes you have to make choices and decisions. For example, when you're reporting on crime and talking to crime victims, how do you conduct your interviews? Do you report their addresses in a story? Is it ethical? If your source that you just spoke to calls you and asks you to send a story for approval before you publish it, is it ethical to do so? We'll talk about a lot of those things this semester as well, because a lot of those questions you will actually come across in your professional practice. Accuracy, fact check, and we'll talk a lot about this as well, because fact checking is at the core. It's pretty much the core element of everything you do as a news writer. Unlike creative writers, news writers have to be absolutely accurate with reality. Then perfect grammar, and that's actually where we come back to the idea of how the law regulates what we do as news writers, because you have to be accurate. Every single fact you publish has to be true. Then perfect grammar, punctuation, and style, and the importance of AP style book as a summary book that really highlights all the differences between traditional English and English that you use to create news pieces. There's a lot of differences there, and we'll discuss that during week 3. Then critical thinking. Overall, critical approach to everything, from press releases to interviews. And we use this term, critical thinking, so often that it almost starts sounding like a cliche, yet it's so important because when you interview sources and they're clearly giving you the information that might be not true or the information that might have a certain bias, you really have to approach it from a critical standpoint. Let's move on to the next slide. So in different areas of the mass media industry, overall professional requirements differ. But there are some things that stay pretty much universal here. When it comes to news writing, inverted pyramid is the key. And it is important to organize your news piece using the inverted pyramid structure instead of the chronological order when we talk about news briefs, for example. We'll talk about what the inverted pyramid is, and we'll discuss it this semester, and we'll try to write some news stories that follow this structure. Next point, radio and television. Here you would have to concentrate on simple and efficient short sentences. Advertising, you would have to write to impress and persuade. Public relations, you would have to create a press release that will attract journalists' attention so that they consider it newsworthy enough. And when you write for the web, you have to consider convergence or interconnectivity. So you would have to use interactive links and interactive elements as part of your news stories.